They miss you in silence, but they will never admit it. You see, the ego is a strange companion. It speaks loudly when it should stay quiet, and stays quiet when truth tries to rise. Michael Sandel once said that the moral worth of a person isn't found in what they claim, but in what they choose to see in others. And often the ego blinds us, not only from others, but from our own reflection. When you walk away from someone's chaos, they will first feel relief. They will tell themselves they don't need you. They will call your calmness cold and your silence arrogance. But deep down, when the noise fades, they start to notice the difference between attention and presence, between company and connection. That's when silence begins to haunt them, because silence has a way of revealing the truth. It's in that quiet space, when ego collapses under its own weight, that people realize the one they dismissed was the one who understood them the most. This isn't about revenge. It's about understanding. Understanding that when you stop feeding someone's ego, you start reminding them of their emptiness. And when that realization dawns, they miss you in silence. They miss the peace you carried, the way you saw them beyond their performance. They miss the calm that didn't demand, and the presence that didn't compete. But by then, it's too late, because your peace became your power, and that power no longer depends on their validation. The illusion of control. Sandel teaches that our society glorifies success as if it were purely earned, and yet in doing so it hides how much luck, grace, and others help shape who we become. Ego lives in that illusion, the illusion that we control everything, that we are always right, that to need others is weakness. But here's the truth. Ego is not strength, it's insecurity in disguise. When people push you away with pride, it's not because you're unworthy, it's because your presence exposes their fragility. You remind them of the humility they lost. Ego whispers, "You're fine without them," but conscience whispers louder, "You miss what was real." Michael Sandel often speaks of humility as a civic virtue, the ability to see that our achievements, our intelligence, even our strength are not solely our own making. That humility allows gratitude to breathe, but ego suffocates it, and when ego leads, relationships die quietly, not in argument but in avoidance, not in betrayal, but in silence. People stop saying sorry not because they stopped caring, but because sorry feels like surrender. They mistake apology for defeat, and humility for weakness. They forget that peace isn't a victory you win, and it's a choice you make. When their ego collapses, they'll remember your silence differently, not as punishment, but as wisdom, not as pride, but as freedom. You stopped explaining yourself, not because you stopped loving, but because explaining to the ego is like pouring truth into a cracked vessel. It never stays. It only leaks resentment. In time, they will look for you again, not in messages, not in words, but in the moments when they crave peace and find none. They will remember the stillness in your presence, the safety in your calm, the depth in your listening. And that's when realization strikes. Ego can win arguments, but it can't replace understanding. It can silence others, but it cannot silence regret. When ego collapses, there comes a day when ego breaks. It doesn't shatter in noise. It crumbles in silence. It's the morning someone wakes up and realizes their pride bought them isolation. It's the night they scroll through memories, and every photo feels heavier than it used to. It's the moment they hear your name, and their heart contracts, not from anger, but from absence. Sandel reminds us that humility begins with recognition. Recognition that we are not self-made islands, but beings woven from the kindness, patience, and forgiveness of others. When that truth sinks in, ego has no place left to hide. Ego can deny facts, but it cannot deny emptiness. They will replay every conversation, every moment they chose pride over peace, and for the first time, they will see themselves clearly. That's when missing you stops being about nostalgia and becomes about realization. Realization that you were not competing, you were connecting, you were not leaving. You are protecting your peace, and that's something ego will never admit, that it needs the very softness it once rejected. When their ego collapses, it feels like losing control, but in truth, it's the first step to seeing clearly. They finally understand that silence was not absence and it was a mirror. It reflected their behavior, their noise, their pride, and when the reflection stares back without judgment, the only thing left is honesty. Honesty is painful, but it's also purifying. Ego dies when truth enters, and what remains is humility, gratitude, the quiet strength to say, I was wrong. That's the moment they truly miss you, not because of who you were to them, but because of who they became without you. They'll never admit it out loud, but deep down, they know they miss you in silence and until their ego collapses, and when it does, they finally hear what your silence was saying all along. The silence of realization. There's a kind of silence that doesn't need words. It's the silence of realization, the silence that arrives when the weight of pride becomes unbearable. When someone loses a good soul, not because of betrayal, but because of neglect, that silence becomes their loudest teacher. Michael Sandel says that a good society begins with the ability to listen. But how can we listen when our ego has already decided who is right and who is wrong? We live in a world that rewards loudness, where volume is mistaken for confidence, and stillness is mistaken for weakness. But truth doesn't shout. It waits. When the mind stops defending and starts reflecting, silence speaks. It says, you pushed away what was healing you. It says, you mistook patience for passivity. It says, you thought winning mattered more than understanding. And that's when the missing begins, not for the person, but for the peace that person brought. You start to miss the moments when you were seen without judgment. You miss the simplicity of being accepted without needing to prove your worth. That's the power of presence, and it doesn't demand recognition while it's there, but it leaves an emptiness when it's gone. In the silence of realization, the ego falls quiet and the heart begins to speak. The moral weight of pride has a cost, not in money, but in relationships. Sandel reminds us that moral worth isn't measured by how high we stand, but by how deeply we care, and when pride takes over, caring becomes conditional. We start to believe that others must earn our respect, while demanding unconditional admiration ourselves. Ego builds walls to keep vulnerability out, but those walls also keep love from entering. The proud build fortresses and call it freedom. But what good is freedom if it locks you inside your own loneliness? When ego collapses, those walls begin to crack. And through those cracks, humility shines, because humility doesn't say, I am less than you. It says, I am part of you. It reminds us that everyone is fighting battles we cannot see, and that the measure of greatness is not how loudly we speak, but how deeply we listen. Pride tells you to win the argument. Humility tells you to protect the connection. And when people finally lose someone who chose connection over conflict, that's when the meaning of love changes for them, forever. They miss not your words, but your presence. They miss not your attention, but your understanding. Because the ego can imitate many things, confidence, charm, even empathy, but it can never imitate sincerity. When you let go, letting go is not an act of defeat. It is an act of trust. You trust that peace will do what pride could not. You trust that silence will reveal what words could not explain. Michael Sandel once said that the deepest form of justice is to give people the chance to reflect, not to humiliate, but to awaken. And when you step back from someone's chaos, you're not abandoning them. You're giving them space to meet themselves. Sometimes you must love from a distance, because distance is the only mirror that shows truth clearly. When you let go, you don't stop caring, you stop controlling. You release the need to be understood, and you start to understand yourself, and something beautiful happens in that space. Your silence starts to speak a new language, the language of boundaries, self-respect, and quiet power. They will feel your absence, not as punishment but as reflection. Because the moment you step away from ego, You stop being a player in someone else's game and become the keeper of your own peace. And that's the lesson ego can never teach. Sometimes walking away is the most loving thing you can do. The return of humility. When ego collapses completely, what's left is humility, raw, trembling, human humility. It's the quiet admission that we were never as self-sufficient as we thought. It's the gentle acceptance that we hurt others not out of strength, but out of fear. Sandel's philosophy reminds us that humility is not the enemy of dignity. It is its foundation. Only those who are humble enough to admit their faults can truly respect others. And so, in the silence after pride fades, some will begin to rebuild. They will reach out softly, not with grand gestures, but with sincerity. They'll send a message, say a quiet sorry, or simply hope you are well. That is humility returning. It doesn't shout for forgiveness. It whispers gratitude. It says, I finally understand. And whether you choose to forgive or move on, know this, you did not lose anything by being kind. They lost peace by being proud. You gained freedom by being silent. The lesson of silence. Silence is not emptiness. It is meaning without noise. Michael Sandel teaches that the moral life is not about proving superiority, but about cultivating understanding. In your silence, you became the lesson. You showed what strength without arrogance looks like, what love without dependency feels like, what boundaries without bitterness sound like. They miss you because your silence was never cruel. It was clear. It said, I still wish you well, but I will not return to where peace cannot live. That's the language of growth. That's the maturity that ego cannot mimic. They'll replay moments in their mind, wondering when they lost you, but truthfully, they lost you the moment they chose pride over peace. And though they may never admit it, your silence taught them the one thing their ego refused to learn, that love is not control, and respect cannot coexist with arrogance. The quiet truth: they miss you in silence, because your presence was a mirror that showed them who they truly were. And though they might never tell you, your absence became their greatest teacher. Michael Sandel says, a just life begins not with certainty, but with humility. And that is the heart of this story. You didn't walk away to be right. You walked away to be free. You didn't stay silent to punish. You stayed silent to protect your peace. And when their ego finally collapses, they will see the truth they once ignored, that you were never the storm. You were the calm after it.